Hi, I'm Pete Draper. I'm here to talk to you about India's visual effects revolution. So we needed to know exactly where an animal was actually traveling. Rajamouli's inputs in post-production they're never vague, they're always to the point. He's very, very educated in that, and that's through exposure and that's through experience. Naatu Naatu was filmed over in Ukraine at the President's Palace. Fortunately, I wasn't there for the shoot, and unfortunately, there's no visual effects in that episode at all. Shots like this, for example, some of my favourites, and the reason for that was primarily we had to make sure that there was a balance between the water and the fire. At that particular point in time, there was very few of us doing it. It's not like today when you can pretty much learn anything that you want to learn off YouTube and stuff like that. So it wasn't until like the mid-2000s when we're starting to get more tutorials, more websites, and a lot more collaborative learning. So back then in the 90s, there was a lot of play by ear and lots of kind of experimentation and kind of call it the golden age, if you like. I feel old now. It did feel a lot more guerrilla than what it does these days. You know, nowadays, one quick search on Google and you can pretty much find anything you want to do. Visual effects has evolved to a degree, but the processes that we tend to do and the analysis that we tend to do are pretty much the same as what they were back then. It's just that systems have got better, computers have got better. We're still getting the same render times now as what we did then. We're just throwing more ingredients at it, so to speak. There's many sides of visual effects that the general audience aren't aware of. There's a metric ton of cleanup work that tends to happen on a show, from rig removals to wire removals, which are obvious. You see someone flying through the air, then obviously they naturally can't fly, so therefore there's been wires, etc. There have been rigs that have been painted out. There's digital doubles which are utilized, there's face replacements, but there's also things like, for example, set extension work which is done, which has normally been called on because it's not physically possible to shoot in such and such a location because of either legal issues or logistical issues or cost issues, that kind of thing. I had the first meeting with him with RRR was topography of what we called the British military base, the BMB, and that was to do with climax portion. So he kind of gave us the general overview of the story. There's these two freedom fighters, the general kind of backstory from it for each one. But primarily what we were trying to get our heads around was the topography of this particular space, because it was integral to not only the climax, but also key stages or key events within the actual primary story. So we needed to know where the actual officers' mess was, where the training grounds were, where the ceremonial grounds were, where the main artillery was, and where the temple was. And each one had to be geographically placed because this guy needed to be able to see this place from here, this guy needed to see this place from here, and so on, depending on what particular beats were going to happen within the story. The police station scene itself, which was Ram's introduction, we shot that at Rajamouli Film City in Hyderabad, based on a set which was built by Sabu Cyril, but the actual space itself was supposed to be in Delhi, on the outskirts of Delhi, and there was specific terrain to that particular area. The terrain was different to what we got in Hyderabad, lots of ups and downs and so on. So we concentrated and built the space around that particular area and populated it as much as we could do in camera. So going by the general rule of thumb of try and get as much close to camera as physically possible, which will actually help you cut down your visual effects requirements. So we're populating up with as much crowd as we can, and generally there was, on an average, around about 300 crowd members. I think it peaked around about the late hundreds kind of things, but largely it was around about 300 which we were working with. So we were shooting a lot of plates, a lot of crowd divisions, and taking these guys and jumbling them up and sticking them over here, and then shooting a plate there and jumbling them up and sticking them over there, which obviously increases the shoot time, but decreases the amount of time that we have to do in post because we don't have to do all these crowd simulation work. We still needed to do a lot of them to stretch out the crowd as far as the eye could see. Once we'd actually followed the general rules and building this system up and populating it that way made life a lot easier. It was actually not directly in front of the police station as it is in the story. It was actually off to the side, and the reason for that was there was a big mound there. We needed to wrap up elements here before we could actually go across and shoot there. And we also then had 2 units, one shooting here, one shooting there, just for kind of B-roll, that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of shots where you had, for example, if you were shooting from the mound, looking towards the police station was CG. If you were shooting from the police station, looking towards the mound was CG, and vice versa. So that's the kind of like general rule of thumb that we had. There is one shot in that entire episode which a lot of people thought was CG, but it actually 90% of it was live, and that's the very close-up shot of Ram's eyeball when you're seeing the reflection of the crowd in his eye. That was a macro shot achieved directly in camera by Sendil. The only CG in it, if you pause it, you can actually see the mound has been added in the background and some additional crowd has been added in the reflection in his eyeball. That's the level of detail we were going with. So for Bheem's introduction, it was primarily shot over in Bulgaria. It was actually the location was sourced by a guy called Juji, who was one of our fight coordinators, primarily because they managed to, because of shoot schedules, they were trying to shoot outside of Delhi for this particular location, so they give that kind of like lush green feel, which is in complete contrast of Ram's desolate, barren and dry, arid space. So they wanted this lush foliage counter to the one that you'd just seen. Locations wise, they found this forest over in Bulgaria, but still they wanted areas which were kind of, you know, foliage which was native to India to be brought over. So Sabul Siril, the art director, he brought in props, he brought in like partial size trees and additional plastic foliage, which was akin to what we get over here, which we also reused in the climax. So the entire sequence, pretty much shot for shot, was blocked, animated, timed by a company called Concept, which was based over in LA.
Back a little bit, he's trying, and the tiger in its panic struggle comes forward and bam, just that. It's pulled out this side, it'll come back, struggling, goes this side and pushes this side.
So they knew what angles they needed to shoot, they knew the timing, how it was going to be, and whether or not there was any additional cutaways that they needed to shoot, any additional angles, because they were only going to be there for a small amount of time, get there, block it out, shoot the thing, and then get out. They couldn't go, oh, we missed this shot, we have to go back and shoot the thing because you're having to fly to another country. So everything had to be neatly planned and executed well in advance. So through very, very neat, what's called pre-visualization, all that managed to be able to be achieved. So that's not just for the camera placements, but it's for the animation of the tiger, it's for the animation of the character also. The bridge scene was actually, again, supervised by Srinivas Martin, who's the principal supervisor on the entire show. This particular episode was a combination of a lot of live action in camera stuff, but a lot of miniature and what they call bigatures. It's not miniature, it's big. Just because of elements such as fire and water. Fire and water, you can simulate them, that's okay. It's very computationally intensive and it's tough to get all the little nuances right. So you try and shoot it if you can. The problem with those shooting miniatures of fire is that fire doesn't scale. Water also doesn't scale. The size of the flames is going to be dictated by the air around it, the physics and so on. There's only so small you can go without it looking like a toy. So they did pretty large scale miniature works for this particular episode. So what was handy was actually on set itself. Not only did they have the miniature work going on here, but if they needed a direct reference, the big one was just literally on the other side of the blue screen. So just walk around and, oh, the paint works like that. Okay, just so everything gels together. So we actually only had one section of live here, which is where the bike and the horse meet. And the other one is basically over in the far corner over here, which is where Bheem and his cohorts are meeting by the riverside. The bike itself, for the large part, was just ridden normally by Tarek or a stunt performer, but there was a rig that was built for the skid going across, and that last shot where the horse pulls up against the railing, that was actually a digital horse that was done by the same company. My favorite scene, I think, was this one. We had a lot of logistical problems to try and overcome. So we're coming out of COVID, gradually phasing back into the office and back into the studio. The actual entire episode itself was challenging to shoot because of the limited amount of people which were allowed on set. The amount of extension that we had to do as a studio compared to earlier on with all the animals coming out, which was largely live backgrounds and just digital animals and so on being put in. We had to recreate all of that in the background itself because we had a limited amount of canvas to play with. Shots like this, for example, were some of my favourites, and the reason for that was primarily we had to make sure that there was a balance between the water and the fire. This guy could not be more powerful than this guy, and this guy could not be more powerful than this guy. So out of the amount of iterations that we went through on some of these ones, the biggest one that we actually ended up having to do was when we had the two guys side by side rolling together, and we had the fire trail running through, we had the water trail trying to run through, and just being able to try and control that water to drop it down so it didn't look like it was overpowering and going to hit that, and this one didn't look like it was flinging out too many sparks so it wouldn't overpower that. So the volume of sparks even on this was which balanced out the amount of water in the previous shot. This one worked really well because we knew for a fact that we got this concept work sent to us from the production department, from the director himself. And when he sends these, we know every single thing on this to the particle needs to be replicated. There's no ambiguity. Didn't even need to say it. For the Animal Havoc episode, there was a lot of pre-production involved in this. So we needed to know exactly where an animal was actually traveling. Now, one of the biggest problems that was encountered previously, as Srinivas Raman, the VFX supervisor, stated, was that when you're filming something in camera, the problem is that there's nothing there. There's no reference as to where the DP needs to frame next and how fast it needs to frame. So there's a lot of pre-production done to determine exactly how fast an animal would run from point A to point B, attack something and run to point C, for example, on the spot itself, so that not only the actor had something to refer to, but the DP, the camera operator, had something to refer to as well to frame up. There was strips of either LEDs which were put in frame, which had a program running to showcase exactly how far and fast these things were jumping. Like the scene where Bheem jumps underneath the tiger that's trying to claw him as it flies over him, that had a strip that had something for the actor to interact off, and had something for the cameraman to interact off as well. So the forest fight was actually shot in 2 or 3 locations. So initially all that build up where Bheem is tending to Ram's injuries, the initial arrow fight, the initial reveal of Ram and the fire coming out and setting light to everything, that was all done on the studio floor. And the reason for that was primarily down to the fact that we could control the space, we could control the environment. We could shoot during the day and we could extend through and design the background and frame it how we wanted to. For wider shots, like when all the bikes started coming through and things started blowing up, it's a bit more dangerous to do that on a studio floor, and so it's a lot more tough to control. It's a lot safer to do it outside. So that was shot at night on location, again at RFC, just on the outskirts. But tying all this together, there had to be this geography, and this goes back to all the way through to the pre-production planning at the beginning. The center around the temple should be this sort of foliage. Then we should have this dry grass space, and then we have this more open, cultivated area, and then that leads on to the armory building. So this goes all the way back to the initial discussion that we had a few years prior, that this should lead to that, to that, to that. Rajamouli's inputs in post-production they're never vague, they're always to the point, they're always to the money, and the good thing about working with him is that he knows he speaks the same language with regards to terminology for visual effects. So he knows about the modeling, he knows about the compositing, he knows about the effects work, he knows about simulation work. He's very, very educated in that, and that's through exposure and that's through experience. So for the set design and for the relative, obviously, same CG extension that we were doing, there has to be obviously a synergy there. So the type of research and the period pieces, for example, signage, for the building styles and what have you, we're doing a lot of reference, we're doing a lot of research into how things looked back then. There are some references still existing in North India, and also the architecture in the UK at the time as well, which also still exists. So we're not only just using the references on one side of the actual street, we're using it on both sides. There's kind of main affluent areas until we actually come to like some of the industrial marketplaces. So we have that complete contrast of this very, very affluent architecture that's going on there. There are actually some little nuances that we threw in there. For example, you know, in the live set itself, they added in some additional stuff like director's wife, for example, has got her own tailor shop, for example, and she's the costume designer on the show, so obviously the tailor shop works. I think there was Sendlil had a photography shop, for example, who was the DP, and also we've got Sudeep's pest control, which is a kind of like a throwback to Eager. So it's always like throw these little kind of like homages in there. It's all right. So it is part of the same world. Naatu Naatu was filmed over in Ukraine at the President's Palace. Fortunately, I wasn't there for the shoot, and unfortunately, there's no visual effects in that episode at all. But I do know there was one or two like little bursts just added for adding a bit of smoke here and there, just to kind of accentuate maybe a foot burst, and that's it. That's all that was done. There was no retiming. I know for a fact that on set, they're doing the action, they're doing the dance. Master's basically making sure everybody's, you know, to the beat, to the time, and then the director's going through it frame by frame by frame, like, right, you're out by 3 frames, okay, go again. So there's lots of meticulous repetition of the action, but just nailing it, absolutely nailing it every single time.